among one of the greatest and most influential people in American history. I will discuss the life and presidency of the writer of the Declaration of Independence and third U.S. head of state, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was born in Blue Ridge Mountains on April 13, 1743. Now, just because of the fact that he was born in Blue Ridge Mountains, you know that I put a lot of Take Me Home Country Roads references in the script. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a self-educated surveyor who owned a large estate that included 60 slaves. According to the Jefferson family, Thomas Jefferson's earliest memory was being carried on a pillow by a slave at the age of 3 when the family moved from Shadwell to Tuckahoe. Thomas Jefferson's mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, was descended from an important Virginian family. She had 2 sons and 6 daughters, and many historians believe that Thomas Jefferson's memories did not gather around her, as very few letters have been found between his mother and him. In 1760, guided by a local schoolmaster, Thomas Jefferson learned Latin and Greek, later entering into the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. He was remembered as an obsessive student, spending over 15 years reading books, 3 hours practicing his violin, and the rest eating and sleeping. He was taught mostly by William Small, a math and science teacher who was born in Scotland, and George Wythe, one of the most influential legal scholars in Virginia at the time. He used many of the things he taught and applied to some of the institutions at the University of Virginia. He read about law with Wythe from 1762 to 1767, later leaving Williamsburg to actually practice law. In legal cases, he often would represent small-scale planters involving land claims and titles. He was considered timid, but still renowned as a formidable legal scholar. In 1768, he built his home, the Monticello, on top of a high mountain. He also became a candidate at the House of Burgesses, showing both his political career and his secluded lifestyle. In the Virginia legislature, he gave very little speeches, but gained a good reputation for opposing Parliament's authority over the colonies. In 1772, he married a wealthy widow named Martha Wales Skelton. As a result of her wealth, Jefferson's number of slaves doubled. 2 years later, he wrote A Summary of the Rights of British America, catapulting his fame throughout the colonies as an advocate for American independence, similar to that of Thomas Paine. The Virginia legislature chose to appoint him as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress in 1775. On June 20th, 1775, he rode into Philadelphia with a certainty for the American cause. Thomas Jefferson usually would shy away from debates, John Adams noting him for being almost completely silent. Jefferson's chief responsibility was to draft resolutions. As a result, he was drafted into a 5-person committee on June 11, 1776, to write a formal statement explaining the American cause for independence. John Adams asked Jefferson to write the first draft, which he had achieved within only a few days. On July 3rd through July 4th, Congress debated and edited Jefferson's draft before sending it to the British government. Afterward, Thomas Jefferson returned to Virginia and reformed the state's legal code to be more in line within the principles of the American Revolution. Many of his resolutions, especially his resolution for religious freedom, were heavily contested. These resolutions showed that his beliefs were younger than the mountains and growing like a breeze. In 1779, he was elected governor of Virginia, but was caught off guard by a British invasion only 1 year later. He fled Virginia, many papers portraying him as a coward who should have been home yesterday. In 1782, his wife died carrying out a difficult delivery of their 3rd daughter. With a teardrop in his eye, those 2 events caused him to vow to never abandon his family for his country. That same year, he reluctantly agreed to serve as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, setting forth the principle that new territories added to the United States should be treated as states after certain conditions were met, not as colonies. In 1784, Jefferson agreed to succeed Benjamin Franklin as the American minister to France. Many of his visions as minister were unsuccessful, and his lifestyle in Paris seemed to contradict what he said, warning Americans against living lives of luxury while he immersed himself in art, architecture, wine, and food. Being a single father, he brought along his elder daughter, Martha, also known as Patsy Jefferson, and later his younger daughter, Maria, also known as Polly. During his time in Paris, he also would write very flirtatious letters whenever he was writing to a woman, especially a certain English-Italian artist named Maria Causeway, who he spent quite a lot of time exploring Paris with, making Jefferson think of Paris as almost heaven. There's also considerable evidence leading to Jefferson having a sexual relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, but we'll get on to that later in the video. Close to the end of Thomas Jefferson's stay in Paris, King Louis XVI convened the Assembly of Notables in Versailles. Jefferson thought of it as essentially a French version of the Constitutional Convention. He believed that the French Revolution would be a bloodless affair that would result in a constitutional monarchy, as opposed to a bloodbath that would result in the Reign of Terror. Fortunately, he left France and came back to the place he belonged before it began. Shortly before his return to Virginia, he wrote Notes on the State of Virginia, which revealed his hypocritically abolitionist stance, as he believed it did not benefit whites or blacks, despite the fact they owned over 100 slaves. In his book, he stated that the institution of slavery violated the values of the American Revolution and that a failure to end it would lead to catastrophic consequences that would lead to the extermination of one or the other race. Despite his staunchly abolitionist stance, his book also revealed that he believed that blacks were genetically inferior and that race mixing was taboo. However, his slave Sally Hemings bore several children who were quite obviously fathered by a white male, many having features similar to Jefferson's. The claims that he had an affair with Hemings first arose in 1802 by a certain journalist, his claims being further backed up by an 1873 newspaper interview by one of Sally Hemings' children, and a 1968 book revealing that she was only pregnant when Jefferson was at the Monticello. In 1998, DNA tests concluded that Jefferson did indeed father many of Hemings' children. Many of Jefferson's admirers believed that the Jefferson-Hemings affair was true love and that they produced one of the most important biracial families in America. Critics of Jefferson view him as a sexual predator with hypocritical views. No matter what character the relationship had, there is no denying that Jefferson did have some biracial children with Sally Hemings. Now, in 1789, Jefferson returned to America and was almost immediately granted a role in George Washington's cabinet as Secretary of State. As he had spent most of his time in France, he did not hold many constitutional views like his friend James Madison did. When he returned, he was concerned about the lack of a Bill of Rights, being more invested in the areas the government cannot intrude, as opposed to how the government should function. As secretary, his chief concern was foreign policy. Within the cabinet, a continuous debate ensued over American policy towards European powers. While all held a more neutral stance, many argued about what position to take on the British-French conflict. George Washington and John Adams advocated for complete neutrality. Alexander Hamilton advocated for a more pro-British neutrality, having more commercial ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson favored a pro-French neutrality, believing that the French Revolution was justified as a European version of our own revolution. When Thomas Jefferson became John Adams' vice president after the 1796 election, he undermined Adams' efforts to have a strict neutrality, going as far as to blame the XYZ affair on American Anglophiles, as he called them. His foreign policy was very much guided by his ideological views, viewing the British form of government as dark and dusty and a relic of the past. When Alexander Hamilton began constructing his fiscal policy, including funding national debt, assuming states' debts, and the creation of a national bank, Thomas Jefferson was staunchly opposed to it, believing that went against the American Revolution and was essentially a continuation of the policies of King George III and the British Parliament. He believed that the Federalists were trying to establish a monarchy on American soil and an aristocracy of bankers. Jefferson had a similarly strict view of the debate over the placement of the national capital, the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion, the Jay Treaty, and the Alien and Sedition Acts. As a result of all this, Alexander Hamilton began the Federalist Party, and Thomas Jefferson began the Republican Party, which later changed its name to the Democratic Republican Party, and no, it is not the same as the modern-day Republican Party. Jefferson and Madison collaborated within this party, being labeled as traitors to the American citizen system by the Federalist press. As Jefferson always does, he contradicted himself, as the formation of the Democratic-Republican Party went against his belief that political parties were evil agents. In 1796, he ran against John Adams, and he lost. 4 years later, one of the most highly contested and aggressive elections in American history began. The Federalists described Thomas Jefferson as a pagan and an atheist, a traitor, a utopian dreamer with anarchist tendencies, and a propagandist. Jefferson, on the other hand, paid journalists to libel Adams, offering the vice presidency to a certain Aaron Burr in return for delivering the electoral votes of New York. At the end of the election, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr actually tied in the Electoral College, leading the House of Representatives to vote, making Jefferson the president and Burr his second in command. When Jefferson was elected, there was speculation over whether the new nation could survive a Jefferson presidency. The Virginia Resolutions of 1798, written in protest to the Alien and Sedition Acts, Jefferson described any form of federal authority over the domestic policy of the states as a violation of the spirit of 76, and even a justification for secession. Many of his viewpoints were later used to justify the secession of the Confederacy. His Federalist critics wondered how he could preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution if his goal was to dismantle the federal institutions given by that document. In his inaugural address, Jefferson famously declared, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," meaning that party battles must cease for the nation to move forward. He thought of his presidency as a revival of the spirit of 76, which he thought had been lost as a result of the rule of the Federalists. Jefferson believed the nation did not require a powerful central government to survive and flourish. In 1804, Jefferson easily won re-election over Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Initially, his policies helped decentralize America by essentially dismantling the Army and the Navy and slashing taxation programs, cutting national debt. These reforms made him considerably popular, and his Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, helped him execute his fiscal policy. Oddly enough, there were very few cabinet meetings, as Thomas Jefferson preferred writing letters. His preference of writing letters also transferred to how he dealt with Congress, as there are actually no records of Thomas Jefferson giving any speeches outside of his 2 inaugural addresses. Thomas Jefferson staying out of the public scene was his way of trying to make the position of the presidency almost invisible, to allow the American people to go on their daily lives without a care for what was going on in Washington. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte sold Louisiana to the United States for pretty much $5. Well, the actual price was about $15 million, but that was still quite a bargain. However, many historians claim that the Louisiana Purchase was the greatest stretch of executive power in American history. Even before the purchase was made official and publicly known, Thomas Jefferson had already sent Meriwether Lewis to lead an expedition to explore these lands. Going against his belief in freedom of expression, Thomas Jefferson demanded that legal action was taken against the Federalists who portrayed him in a bad light. He also treated Aaron Burr quite harshly after he was arrested for treason. Jefferson believed that Burr was attempting to establish a monarchy in the southwest United States, although very low evidence was found of whether or not this was true. As a result of the French blockading the Atlantic and Caribbean, limiting American trade, Jefferson issued the Embargo Acts near the end of his presidency. The Embargo Acts closed all American ports to all foreign imports and American exports. He believed that this would make France and Britain change their policy, but the act actually backfired. By the end of his presidency, Jefferson had lost much of his popularity and was eager to retire. Thomas Jefferson lived his last years with a rather productive but crowded schedule. He would rise at dawn each day, bathe his feet in cold water, write letters to friends and stuff, and work in his garden. In the afternoon, he would take a 2-hour ride around his grounds. At dinner, he would provide for his daughter and her 12 children, alongside their visitors, sometimes housing as many as 50 guests. Because of the lack of privacy, Jefferson built another house in Bedford Estate, about 90 miles away from Monticello. Thomas Jefferson had a knack for architectural projects, continuing to work on the Monticello until the end of his life. Another important architectural project was the Poplar, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the Poplar Forest in Bedford, a mansion created by Thomas Jefferson that is a perfect octagon and was used when Jefferson needed a getaway. Lastly was the University of Virginia, which he surveyed based off of the Pantheon in Rome. The centerpiece of the building was flanked by living quarters for students and faculty. This university was arguably one of Jefferson's greatest achievements outside of politics. In 1812, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson began writing letters to each other once again. Their friendship was essentially organized by Benjamin Rush, who called them the North and South Poles of the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson linked the success of the American Revolution to its break from the past, while John Adams believed it was a success because of its preservation of the past. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson sent letters regarding various topics, revealing their views as time went on. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826. His last words were, "Is it the 4th?" Ironically, John Adams died later that same day, with his last words being, "Thomas Jefferson still lives." Perhaps that was literally wrong, as Jefferson had died hours before him, but he was symbolically correct, as Thomas Jefferson's vision for America outlived John Adams, making Thomas Jefferson one of the most influential figures in American history. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. In my next video, I hope to discuss the life and legacy of Jesus of Nazareth as a way to celebrate Christmas. Thank you for watching.